Hi, everyone. I wanted to talk about my latest article that just went up today at the Atlantic Sentinel. And it is about George Bush's foreign policy legacy. And the piece in many ways is a response to a lot of the commentary that I've seen on Bush and his record on foreign policy. In retrospect, I think generally Bush has received positive or favorable ratings on foreign policy, in large part on account of the way he really held the transatlantic alliance together after the Cold War, when many thought that these partnerships were no longer relevant, and he kept NATO together, which has continued to be, I would argue, a cornerstone of global security. And I think that obviously sort of implicit, or in many cases, it said quite openly that Bush's record as an internationalist, as a multilateralist, is contrasted to many of the foreign policy missteps that occurred after his watch. But I think that this narrative, it's all true, and I think it's an important part of his legacy. But I think that it has led people to forget or maybe ignore another side of his foreign policy legacy, which I would argue has been not only as decisive, perhaps, as his multilateralism and so forth, but also it may end up proving to be actually the more significant factor. And that is Bush's very deep ambivalence about America as a global policeman, and the extent to which the U.S. ought to be intervening in various conflicts, especially those that may or may not be within the realm of core U.S. national security interests. And I think what really a key decision that Bush made that I think has not gotten enough attention, that I talk about in my article here, is his deeply ambivalent attitude and approach and ultimate decision on Yugoslavia. So, okay, so the backdrop here was basically that as the Cold War was winding down, and even the most cynical people came to really recognize that the Soviet Union was changing its ways, that the Cold War was winding down, we were entering into a new period. There was a debate now about what do we do with NATO, and what will transatlantic relations look like? How will the European countries, will they chart their own course? Will they unify, and how much is the U.S. going to remain involved with European affairs? So this was an ongoing issue, and you had on both sides of the Atlantic people who were quite divided on this issue. There were on the U.S. side people on the one hand who were more than happy to hand off security responsibilities to the Europeans and really start to retrench and focus more on American affairs. On the other hand, there were people who very much wanted to preserve a U.S.-led security architecture in Europe. And then on the European side, there was also ambivalence that obviously the reason why the U.S. had gotten so involved in European affairs in the first place is because the Europeans themselves came to realize that the security blanket that the U.S. provided was beneficial. But people also recognized, too, that this was an opportunity for Europe now to come out of the American shadow and really start to take on a role of its own. So, okay, so this debate is happening, and I talk here about basically this debate about the transatlantic alliance is now coinciding with a volatile, restive movements on the outer edges of the Soviet Empire. One of the things I think is worth mentioning here is that when we talk about the Soviet Union, what this really was in many ways was, many historians have argued that the Soviet Union actually ought to be understood as a Russian empire, in the sense that you have Russia, and then you had what the Soviet Union really was actually a compilation of many different independent sovereign countries that had existed at some point in the past with their own traditions, their own language, their own people. But they were submerged under this entity of the Soviet Union that was, in many ways, arguably a Russian empire. So, obviously, as the Soviet Union is dissolving now, you have all these issues that had sort of more or less been held at bay during the Cold War now erupt, and you have nationalist movements that are coming to the fore. You have an array of territorial disputes. You have people of different ethnicities and so forth wanting to chart their own course. And so Yugoslavia really emerges as a powder keg here. So okay, so now we're in the latter half of 1991, and Croatia and Slovenia are moving toward independence, and they're doing so fully aware that if they break away, that Serbia may invade, and this could very much be the impetus for an outbreak of regional war right on the borders of Italy and Greece, and this crisis in Yugoslavia is happening when the West is deeply divided on the future of NATO. I quote in the article, for example, there was a noted piece in the journal International Security by Charles and Clifford Kupchan, who, they were basically arguing that NATO should cede increasing responsibility to some kind of a pan-European concert-based collective security organization. And other people, even if they didn't necessarily like the idea of Europe going its own way, nevertheless were basically thinking that NATO and an independent European power was an eventuality, and that this is what's going to happen. So, Bush was kind of wary here that on the one hand, he didn't really like the idea of the Europeans forging a common security role. He wanted to preserve NATO. He wanted the U.S. to remain an active participant in European security, and he even began to reform NATO in a way that would allow NATO to take on missions that were, quote, out of area, meaning he was thinking that perhaps NATO could expand the scope of its responsibilities and what the kind of challenges that it might take on. But at the same time as this is happening, which is this conceptual debate, you have Serbia really emerging as a real problem. So, the Serbian leader, Slobodan Milosevic, he's a nationalist Serb, and he's seeing this debate in NATO, and he reaches the conclusion that, whatever the debate is, NATO's not going to get in the way if the Yugoslav army goes into Croatia and Slovenia. So he orders troops into these areas, and not surprisingly, a war breaks out. Now, the question now becomes, okay, so what do we do about this Yugoslav conflict? And there was so at the time, speaking on behalf of the then 12-member European states, Luxembourg's foreign minister, Jacques Pousse, declared in a now infamous quote, he said, "This is the hour of Europe, not the hour of the Americans. If one problem can be solved by the Europeans, it is the Yugoslav problem. This is a European country, and it's not up to the Americans." Now, this was considered kind of a highly provocative, bold comment that he made. And a lot of people who were sort of weary of European ambitions really took umbrage at this. But Bush himself was in a sense fine with this. He basically he wanted he preferred that the Europeans deal with the Yugoslavia problem themselves, and so he wrote in his diary. He wrote, I've told our top people, quote, we don't want to put a dog in this fight. It's not the one that we have to mastermind. This concept that we have to work out every problem everywhere in the world is crazy. So what the Bush administration basically did, they said, okay, fine, we'll think about this Yugoslav problem. We'll consult through channels within the European community, and NATO would basically define the conflict of Yugoslavia as being out of area, outside of NATO's scope. So NATO doesn't have to intervene here if it doesn't want to. Now, this is it sounds technical, but this was a remarkable moment, because basically this, in effect, marked the first major issue in Western security since the Suez Crisis in the 1950s, where the U.S. had not taken a lead on a major issue. Basically, this, the assumption here is that Yugoslavia was an important area for the U.S. in the context of the Cold War, but not anymore. And and basically later on, as people suspected, David Gompert, the president's national security director for Europe and Asia, he later reflected that basically all these decisions were very much by design, that they wanted to not only deal with this as a solution to the Yugoslavia problem, but they also wanted to send a broader message about the U.S. role in the world and what it would look like now that the Cold War was winding down. So Gompert wrote, quote, George Bush and his lieutenants studied the facts and concluded that leadership in this crisis, the crisis being Yugoslavia, would have had major drawbacks for the U.S. Following the Gulf War, a leading role in Yugoslavia would have implied that the United States could and would act as international policeman, even in an area of more immediate importance to America's rich European partners. And so basically the U.S. kind of hands off this Yugoslavia thing to the Europeans, and the consequences were quite devastating. That, as many of you might remember from this period, ultimately this issue led to the worst atrocities on the European continent since World War II, and this was happening at a time when cable news and other media were really reporting on these atrocities with a amount of detail and so forth that was just quite jarring. And ultimately, American leaders, the American people, thought that these atrocities were too much to bear for the country's conscience. And within a few years, NATO ended up having to intervene in Bosnia, and then a few years later in Kosovo. This was a sort of bombing campaign and so forth that ultimately led, in the end, to the overthrow of the Milosevic government. And the lesson that I think it's fair to say that really took over Washington and U.S. policymakers was that one, the U.S. could not simply watch these atrocities happen and not do anything about it, that we had a moral, strategic imperative to do something about it. And secondly, that these weren't the type of problems that could be left to our allies, that if the U.S. didn't act, these things would get out of control, and that there really in the real world wasn't an immediate solution or alternative to American power. And then third, the relative success of these operations showed that the U.S. could intervene and basically resolve these problems without too much loss of life or cost or so forth. And this produced a great deal of confidence in American policymakers that they could act, often unilaterally, certainly in a leadership role, deploy the military, and that American power was a force for good. And this line of thinking, I think, accounts a large part for why the Iraq War and the Iraq invasion, as controversial as it was, what really did enjoy bipartisan support both among the foreign policy establishment and also in Congress. If you look at the votes authorizing the use of force, they weren't particularly close, and an assumption throughout the Iraq debate that even a lot of critics of the war conceded at the time was that, you know, the U.S. can probably handle this. We can probably remove Saddam. We can probably engineer an outcome here that's broadly beneficial for everyone. And even after the Iraq conflict went bad, I mean, this self-confidence in American power continues with mixed results, as we've seen in Libya and Afghanistan and elsewhere. So what I tried to do in this short article here is talk about the Yugoslavia issue, talk about how Bush's ambivalence on the issue had very lasting, deep consequences, and in many ways that this may end up being the way that his ambivalence and caution informed and encouraged, emboldened people who wanted a more active American role, how that's an important part of his legacy. So hope you enjoy it. Leave a comment or let me know what you think.